The guy who humiliated me in front of the whole school thought he had gotten away with it forever. But 10 years later, I ended up being his boss, and revenge came in the most unexpected way. Guys, I have to tell you this story because I still can't believe how things turned out. It's about something that happened in high school and how the universe has very strange ways of bringing justice. I know it sounds like a movie, but I swear all of this is real. First, I need to give you some context about what I was like in high school because it's important to understand why what happened marked me so deeply. I was the typical chubby nerd with glasses. My name was Daniel, but everyone called me Danny the Brain, or worse. It was 2010, I was 16 years old, and I was one of those kids who knew all the answers in class but had no idea how to talk to a girl. I came from a working-class family. My dad was a mechanic and my mom worked part-time in an office. Nothing glamorous, but they always supported me in my studies. They knew I was smart and that was my chance to have a better life than theirs. At my high school, there was this super marked social hierarchy, like in all schools I guess. At the top were the popular kids, the athletes, the cheerleaders, the rich kids. I was at the bottom, in the group of weirdos who ate alone in the corner of the cafeteria. But there was one guy who was at the very top of that social pyramid. His name was Brandon Marquez. He was the son of the owner of the biggest car dealership in town, super handsome, captain of the football team, dating the most popular girl in school. Everything I wasn't. Brandon wasn't exactly a typical bully. He didn't beat me up or steal my lunch money. His thing was more subtle and, in some ways, worse. He humiliated me publicly with funny comments that made everyone laugh. He was an expert at making me feel like the lowest scum on the planet without even touching me. During sophomore year, I had this super silly crush on a girl named Andrea. She was pretty, smart, and unlike the rest of the popular kids, she was occasionally kind to me. She was probably just being polite, but my 16-year-old brain interpreted any smile as a sign that maybe I had a chance. The biggest mistake of my high school life was deciding to ask Andrea to the spring dance. I had been planning how to do it for weeks. I practiced my speech in front of the mirror, wrote and rewrote what I was going to say. Finally, I gathered the courage one Friday at lunch. Andrea was sitting with her friends at a table near the area where I usually sat. I approached, sweating like I had just run a marathon, and said, "Hi Andrea, can I talk to you for a second?" She smiled and stood up. "Sure, Danny. What's up?" So far so good. But what I didn't know was that Brandon and his friends were sitting at the table right next to us, perfectly positioned to hear the entire conversation. "Well," I began, my voice trembling, "I wanted to ask you if you'd like to go with me to the spring dance." Andrea looked genuinely surprised, but not in a bad way. "Oh, Danny, it's very sweet of you to ask." Before she could finish the sentence, Brandon stood up from his table and walked over to us with that smile I had learned to fear. "Seriously, Brainiac?" he said loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "You're asking Andrea to go to the dance with you?" The whole cafeteria went silent. It was like one of those movie scenes where the protagonist knows he's about to be publicly destroyed but can't do anything to stop it. "Brandon, stay out of it," Andrea said, but her voice sounded more annoyed than defensive of me. No, let me understand this," Brandon continued, now circling me like a shark. "You, Daniel, who's never had a girlfriend, who spends recess reading computer books, are asking the prettiest sophomore girl to go with you to the dance?" I could hear chuckles across the cafeteria. My face was red as a tomato. I tried to say something, but Brandon cut me off. "You know what, Brainiac? I think it's hilarious that you think you even have a chance. I mean, look at you." He turned to Andrea. "Andrea, tell him the truth. Would you seriously go to the dance with this loser?" The silence that followed was deafening. Andrea looked at me with a mix of pity and discomfort. "Danny, I already have a date for the dance," she said softly. But Brandon wasn't done. "You know what would be fun?" he said to his friends, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "If someone made a bet on how many girls will reject Brainiac before he realizes he's completely out of his league." The laughter grew louder. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. "In fact," Brandon continued, "I'd bet my whole month's allowance that no girl in this school would go to the dance with Daniel. Not the theater girls, not the science club girls, not even the desperate ones." At that moment, something broke inside me. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the way Brandon had turned my most vulnerable moment into public entertainment. I turned and ran out of the cafeteria. Literally ran like a little kid. Behind me I heard the laughter of the whole school. That day I went home early pretending to be sick. My mom could tell something bad had happened, but I didn't tell her anything. I locked myself in my room and cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. The following days were horrible. The story had spread all over school. Wherever I went, I could hear whispers and giggles. Brandon had managed to turn me into the official joke of high school. But the worst part wasn't the public humiliation. The worst part was that Brandon had been right. No girl wanted to go to the dance with me. Not even the girls from my own social group wanted to be associated with someone who had been so publicly ridiculed. I ended up going to the dance alone because my mom forced me, telling me I couldn't let some stupid kid ruin something so important. It was the most miserable night of my high school life. That incident changed something fundamental in me. I didn't become antisocial or violent, but I did become super ambitious. I decided that someday I was going to prove to Brandon and everyone who laughed that day that they were wrong about me. I became obsessively dedicated to my studies. My grades, which were already good, became perfect. I started competing in math and science competitions at the state level. I taught myself programming and developed my first app when I was 17. I also worked on changing physically. I started going to the gym, changed my style of dress, even got laser surgery so I wouldn't need glasses. By the time I graduated, I was no longer the chubby nerd who had been humiliated in the cafeteria. I earned a full scholarship to study systems engineering at a top private university in the capital. Brandon stayed in town, studied business at the local university, and from what I saw on Facebook, went on to work at his dad's business. During college, I focused completely on preparing for the future. I studied like crazy, did internships at major companies, learned several programming languages, and even developed a couple of apps that sold well. By the time I graduated at 22, I already had job offers from several major tech companies. I decided to work in the US for 2 years to gain international experience and save money. During all that time, Brandon occasionally popped up on my social media. He was living the typical small-town rich kid life, working at his dad's dealership, married to his high school girlfriend, nice house, frequent vacations. He seemed happy and successful within the standards of our town. But I had bigger plans. After 2 years in the US, I returned to Mexico with a good amount of savings and an idea for my own software development company. I knew I wanted to go back to my hometown not out of nostalgia, but because I had identified a niche market no one was exploiting there. The idea was to create a company that developed management systems specifically for car dealerships and auto shops. I had seen in the US how this type of software could revolutionize efficiency in these businesses, but in my city everyone was still using outdated systems. I invested all my savings into starting the company. I rented a small but modern office in the city's newest commercial area, hired 3 fresh graduate programmers, and started networking with dealership and shop owners. My business plan was solid. Offer an integrated system to manage inventory, sales, service, accounting, and customer relations, all from an easy-to-use platform. Plus, I offered full training and 24/7 technical support. The first few months were tough. Many business owners in the city were conservative and distrustful of a young guy with modern ideas. But little by little, I started landing small clients who were desperate to modernize. My first big success was with the city's largest auto shop. I implemented my system and within 6 months they had increased efficiency by 40% and profits by 25%. Word started to spread. By the end of my first year, I had 15 clients and needed to hire more staff. My company was becoming the local go-to for automotive management systems. It was in my second year of operations that the opportunity one had unknowingly been waiting for arrived. One day, I received a call from someone who introduced himself as the general manager of Marquez Autos, the city's largest dealership. Brandon's dad's dealership. "Good morning, am I speaking with Daniel Herrera from Integrated Automotive Systems?" he said. "Yes, that's me. Look, we've heard great things about your work. We're interested in completely modernizing our systems. Could you come in for a presentation?" My heart started pounding. This was the biggest account I could land in the city, but it also meant I would inevitably run into Brandon. "Of course," I said. "When would be convenient?" We scheduled a meeting for the following week. It would be at the dealership's offices with the entire management team present. I spent a week preparing the most thorough presentation of my life. I analyzed every possible aspect of their business, prepared custom demos, calculated savings and efficiency projections specifically for them. I knew this was my chance not only to win the biggest client, but to show Brandon what I was made of. On the day of the presentation, I dressed in my best suit, mentally rehearsed my pitch, and drove to the dealership where so many childhood memories were tied. It was strange being back. I remembered going there with my dad as a kid, always feeling inferior because we knew we couldn't afford the new cars. Now I was walking in as the owner of the city's most successful software company. The general manager, a very professional older man, welcomed me. He took me to the boardroom, which was impressive. A huge glass table, panoramic view of the showroom, state-of-the-art screens. Daniel, he said, let me introduce you to the team. Here's our sales manager, our service manager, our accountant, and, he paused as the last person walked in, our operations manager, Brandon Marquez. For a second, time completely stopped. Brandon walked into the room with the same confidence I remembered from high school, but something had changed. He had gained a lot of weight, had a receding hairline, and looked tired. When he saw me, his expression completely shifted. First confusion, then recognition, then what looked like panic. Daniel? He said as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Daniel Herrera? Hello, Brandon, I said with the most professional smile I could muster. Nice to see you after so many years. The rest of the team didn't understand what was happening, but it was obvious there was history between us. You two know each other? Asked the general manager. We were classmates in high school, I explained, keeping my tone completely professional. Brandon looked super uncomfortable. He sat at the table trying to regain composure, but I could see he was nervous. I began my presentation, and from the first minute I knew I had it in the bag. I had done my homework, I knew their business better than they did, and I had solutions to problems they didn't even know they had. Throughout the presentation, Brandon barely spoke. The other managers asked questions, took notes, looked impressed. But Brandon just stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. When I finished the technical presentation, the general manager asked me about implementation and costs. My numbers were competitive but not cheap. This was enterprise-level software. And what references do you have with companies our size? The service manager asked. That was where I shined. I listed all my clients, the results they had achieved, the recommendation letters I had. By then I was already working with the state's 3 most important dealerships. They were the only one missing for me to have complete dominance. Very impressive, said the general manager. Could you give us a moment to discuss internally? Of course. I'll wait in reception. I stepped out of the boardroom and sat in the waiting area. Through the glass windows I could see they were having an intense discussion. Brandon gestured a lot, seemed to be arguing passionately, but the rest of the team contradicted him. After 20 minutes, the general manager came out alone. Daniel, the team is very impressed with your proposal. We want to proceed with implementation. Excellent, I said. When can we start? There's just one detail, he said, lowering his voice. Brandon expressed some personal concerns about working with you. Something about your history in high school. My heart stopped. Was Brandon seriously trying to sabotage this over something that happened more than 10 years ago? I understand, I said calmly. And what's the company's position on this? The general manager smiled. Look, Daniel, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've seen a lot. What matters here are results and professionalism. Your work speaks for itself. He leaned closer and lowered his voice further. Between you and me, Brandon is the owner's son, but that doesn't mean he makes the important decisions. And frankly, we urgently need to modernize to stay competitive. So we're going to move forward with you. But I need to ask you for a professional favor. I know you two have history, but for the sake of the project, I hope you can keep things strictly professional. Of course, I said. I'm here to do a job, not to settle past issues. We signed the contract that same afternoon. It was the biggest project my company had landed so far, worth nearly $500,000 and including a 3-year support contract. When I left the dealership, I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The kid who had been humiliated in the high school cafeteria had just landed the biggest contract of his career, and Brandon Marquez was going to be his direct subordinate on the project. The irony was delicious, but I also realized I had a huge responsibility. If I ruined this project out of personal resentment, I could destroy my reputation and my company. I had to remain completely professional. Implementation began 2 weeks later. My team and I arrived at the dealership on day 1 ready to start installing and configuring the systems. Brandon was assigned as my main contact within the company, which meant we would have to work closely together over the next 3 months. The first days were super tense. Brandon was polite but cold, answered my questions with one-word responses, and it was obvious he didn't want to be there. But as the weeks went by, something interesting started happening. Brandon realized I really knew what I was doing, and that my system was going to make his job a lot easier. One afternoon, while reviewing inventory reports, Brandon said to me, Daniel, I have to admit this is turning out incredible. The old system was a total disaster. Thanks, I said. This is exactly what I designed the software for. There was an awkward silence, then Brandon added, Look, about high school. Brandon, I interrupted, we're working. That was more than 10 years ago. We're adults now. No, let me say this, he insisted. What I did to you in the cafeteria that day was really wrong. I was a stupid teenager who thought humiliating you made me look better. His honesty surprised me. It's okay, Brandon. It's in the past. No, it's not okay. I've thought about that many times over the years. Especially after you started becoming successful and people in town started talking about you. That caught my attention. People talk about me? Do you really not know? He asked. Daniel, you're like the local success story. The nerdy kid who left and came back as a successful entrepreneur. Everyone talks about how you proved to the town that brains are worth more than family connections. It was the first time I heard that perspective. I had been so focused on building my company that I hadn't realized how I was perceived in the community. And what do you think about that? I asked him. Brandon stayed quiet for a moment. I think you were right and I was wrong. I think I wasted the chance to be your friend instead of your enemy. That conversation completely changed our work dynamic. Brandon started being genuinely collaborative, even helping me identify problems and opportunities one hadn't seen. One night, working late to finish the data migration, Brandon invited me for a beer after. You know what's the craziest part of all this? He said as we drank at a bar near the dealership. What? That you're probably the first person in years who sees me as more than the owner's son. Everyone here respects me because of my last name, but with you I have to earn respect with real work. I realized Brandon had also been living in a prison, just a golden one. He had never had to prove his real value because he had always had his family's backing. Do you like working at the dealership? I asked. Honestly? No. I always wanted to study graphic design, but my dad told me it was a waste of time, that I had to prepare to run the family business. And why don't you do it now? At 26? With a wife and mortgage? It's too late. It's never too late, I told him. If I had let myself be defined by what happened in high school, I wouldn't be here right now. That night we ended up talking like two normal people, not like enemies with a history. It was the first time I saw Brandon as more than just the popular guy who humiliated me. The project was a complete success. Within 3 months the dealership had transformed completely. Efficiency skyrocketed, costs dropped, and customer satisfaction went through the roof. At the final presentation of results, with the dealership's owner present, Brandon's dad, the general manager said, Daniel, this has been the most successful project in the dealership's history. Your company has changed the way we work. We hope this is the beginning of a long relationship. Brandon's dad, who had always struck me as a super strict man, actually stood up and shook my hand firmly. You're a genius, young man. Congratulations. I could see the pride in Brandon's face, though it wasn't exactly pride for himself. It was more like pride for having been part of the project. After the presentation, Brandon approached me privately. Daniel, I don't know if this means anything coming from me, but I admire you. A lot. You turned humiliation into fuel to become someone incredible. I smiled. Thanks, Brandon. I admire that you were man enough to admit your mistakes. We shook hands not as enemies, but as professionals who had finally buried the past. And you know what? That moment taught me the real meaning of revenge. Revenge isn't humiliating the person who hurt you the same way they did. Revenge is becoming so successful, so unshakable, that the ghosts of your past can't hurt you anymore. Revenge is not just showing your enemy they were wrong, but turning them into someone who now respects you. Today, 10 years after that humiliation in the cafeteria, Brandon Marquez and I actually maintain a cordial relationship. Sometimes we even collaborate on community projects. He never became my best friend, but he became someone I no longer resent. And every time I pass by my old high school and remember that day, I smile. Because what felt like the worst day of my life was actually the turning point that pushed me to build the life I have today.